My name is Alex. I am a student, and I have a dream. I dream of speaking English like a native speaker. I dream of traveling the world, meeting new people, and having the freedom to do things that require good English skills. I want to find a good job, make friends from all over the world, and maybe even live in a country where English is the main language. But the path to that dream was not easy. I remember the first time I decided to learn English. I was in high school, and we were given the choice to pick a second language to study. My friends chose French, Spanish, and German, but I chose English. It felt like the right choice. Everyone spoke English in movies, books, and songs. It was the language of business, science, and the internet. I wanted to be part of that world. At first, everything seemed so exciting. The teacher was nice, and the lessons were interesting. But soon, I realized that English was harder than I thought. There were so many new words, and the rules were confusing. The grammar felt strange, and the pronunciation was difficult. I didn't understand everything, and I started to get frustrated. I felt like I was falling behind. Why couldn't I understand English as easily as my classmates? In the beginning, I made many mistakes. I would speak slowly, and people would look at me, trying to figure out what I was saying. I couldn't form sentences quickly. My vocabulary was small, and I felt embarrassed when I tried to speak. My classmates would speak fast, and I could only catch a few words. I started to doubt myself. One day, I went home feeling tired and discouraged. I had just finished an English test, and I had failed. I wanted to give up. Maybe English wasn't for me. Maybe I should just stick to my native language. I didn't want to study anymore. I sat in my room, staring out of the window, wondering if it was worth it. Maybe I'll never learn English. Maybe I will never be good enough. I was about to make a decision to quit learning when something happened that changed everything. It was a sunny afternoon, and I decided to take a walk outside to clear my mind. I walked to the park near my house, where I like to sit and relax. As I entered the park, I saw an old man sitting on a bench. He was reading a book, and his face was calm and peaceful. I didn't know why, but I felt like I should talk to him. Maybe it was because I had been feeling so down, and I wanted someone to listen to me. I walked up to the bench and sat down next to the old man. He looked up from his book and smiled. "Hello, young man. How are you today?" I smiled back, but I didn't know how to answer. I was lost in my thoughts. "I am not so good," I said quietly. He raised an eyebrow, curious. "Why is that?" I sighed. "I have been learning English, but it's so hard. I feel like I'm not improving. I don't know if I can do it." The old man nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly how I felt. "Ah, yes. Learning a new language can be very difficult, especially English. But let me tell you something." I looked at him, waiting for his advice. "When I was your age," he began, "I wanted to learn English too. I was living in a small town, and no one around me spoke English. I didn't have the resources you have today. There were no internet lessons, no apps, no YouTube videos, but I wanted to learn. I had a dream, just like you. I felt a spark of hope. You wanted to learn English too?" I asked, surprised. "Yes," he said with a smile. "But I struggled at first. I couldn't speak very well. My vocabulary was small, and I didn't know how to form sentences correctly. But I kept trying. I made a lot of mistakes, and sometimes I wanted to give up. But I didn't need. I leaned forward, curious to hear more. "How did you keep going? What helped you not give up?" The old man paused for a moment, thinking. "I kept going because I had a secret weapon, something that made learning English more fun, more interesting, and more useful. And that secret weapon was stories." "Stories?" I repeated, not sure if I understood. "You mean books?" "Yes, books are part of it," he said. "But I also listened to stories, told stories, and even imagined stories in my head. You see, stories are the key to learning any language. They help you remember words, understand grammar, and practice speaking. Stories bring language to life." "That sounds interesting," I said. "But how did stories help you learn English?" The old man smiled. "Let me explain. When I started learning English, I would listen to simple stories. Stories with easy words and clear sentences. At first, I didn't understand everything, but I didn't give up. I would listen to the same stories over and over again. With each listen, I understood a little more. The more I listened, the more I learned. I was amazed. You listen to stories over and over again? Yes, he said. At first, I could only understand a few words, but little by little, I started understanding the entire story. And when I understood the story, I could use the words I learned in my own sentences. I also started reading stories, books, short stories, and even newspapers. Reading stories helped me see new words and learn how sentences are built. That sounds like fun, I said, my eyes lighting up. But what about speaking? I'm not very good at speaking English. The old man chuckled. Speaking is important too, but the key to speaking well is practicing, and practicing stories is a great way to do that. You don't need to be perfect. Just try to speak, even if you make mistakes. The more you practice, the better you will become. I felt a new sense of motivation. I think I understand now. Stories can help me learn English in a fun way. It's not just about memorizing grammar rules or vocabulary. It's about using English in real-life situations. Exactly, the old man said. And you don't have to do it alone. Find stories that interest you, stories that make you feel excited. Watch movies, listen to podcasts, and read books. The more you do it, the easier it will get. We talked for a while longer, and I felt better. The old man's words gave me a new perspective on learning English. I realized that I didn't have to be perfect right away. I didn't have to speak like a native speaker overnight. It was okay to make mistakes. The important thing was to keep going and enjoy the journey. Thank you for talking to me, I said, as I stood up to leave. The old man nodded. Remember, Alex, don't quit. Keep learning with stories. And one day, you will look back and be amazed at how far you have come. I walked home with a new sense of hope. I promised myself that I would not quit. I would continue learning English with stories. I would listen to them, read them, and even create my own stories. And I would keep practicing speaking, even if I made mistakes. That night, I went to bed excited to start a new chapter in my language learning journey. The next day, I began by watching an English movie with subtitles. I picked a simple one, something fun and easy to understand. It wasn't perfect, but I didn't care. I was enjoying myself. And with each story, I learned something new. Slowly but surely, my English improved. The days after my conversation with the old man were different. I felt a new energy inside me. I couldn't wait to start learning English in a new way. I spent the next few weeks following his advice, listening to stories, watching movies in English, and reading books that were interesting and fun. At first, it wasn't easy. The words were sometimes hard to understand, and I would often pause to look up a word or phrase. But as time passed, something amazing began to happen. My vocabulary started growing. Slowly, I began recognizing words that I had never seen before. And with every new word, I felt more confident. I began to understand the movies I watched a little more. The characters' conversations started to make sense, and I could follow the story without looking at the subtitles as much. It felt like I was unlocking a new level of understanding. I also started reading English books. I didn't pick up anything too difficult at first. I started with simple children's books, ones that were written for beginners. These books were filled with short sentences, colorful pictures, and easy vocabulary. I found myself enjoying them more than I expected. As I turned the pages, I imagined the stories in my mind. It was like I was living inside the story, experiencing the adventure with the characters. And with every page I read, I learned new words and expressions. One of the first books I finished was a simple story about a young girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor. It wasn't a long book, but it was full of new vocabulary that I had never learned in class. Words like hospital, doctor, nurse, and medicine became part of my vocabulary. More importantly, the book taught me how to use these words in different situations. I learned how to describe feelings, places, and actions. The more I read, the more I realized that learning English wasn't just about memorizing grammar rules or words from a list. It was about understanding the context in which those words were used. It was about learning how people communicate, how stories are told, and how emotions are expressed. And the best way to learn all of this was through stories. One afternoon, I was at the library when I found a book that caught my attention. It was a collection of short stories written in simple English. The cover was colorful and had a picture of a spaceship, which immediately made me curious. I took the book off the shelf and started flipping through the pages. Each story was short, with only a few pages, but they were all exciting. There were stories about space, time travel, and strange adventures. I decided to check it out and take it home. When I started reading the first story, I was amazed at how much I could understand. The sentences were simple, but the ideas were fascinating. The story was about a group of astronauts who traveled to a distant planet. They met strange creatures and had to solve problems in order to survive. It was an adventure that kept me hooked, and every time I turned the page, I learned more about English. As I read, I stopped and highlighted words I didn't understand. Some were easy to guess from the context of the story, while others I had to look up. I found that by doing this, I was not only learning new words, but also understanding how to use them in different situations. For example, the word explore came up several times in the story. I learned that explore could mean both travel to a place to learn more about it and look closely at something to discover new things. I began using my new words in conversations. At first, it felt awkward. I was worried I might make mistakes, but I remembered what the old man had told me. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Keep practicing. So, I kept speaking, even if it was just with myself. I practiced saying the new words I had learned in sentences. I imagined myself in the stories I read, talking to the characters, and going on adventures with them. One evening, I met a group of students at my school who were also learning English. We all decided to meet at the library to practice speaking. Some of them were better than others, but we all helped each other. We took turns telling stories, and I started to notice something incredible. The more we spoke, the more natural it felt. At first, we spoke slowly, but by the end of our meeting, we were speaking with more confidence. We had learned so much from the stories we shared. One of my friends, Maria, told a story about her trip to the beach. She used simple words, but she painted such a clear picture with her story. As she spoke, I could see the beach in my mind. I could hear the waves crashing and feel the warm sun on my skin. Her story was simple, but it was full of details that made it come alive. It reminded me that stories weren't just about learning new words, they were about sharing experiences and connecting with others. After that day, I realized that stories had become my best tool for learning. I didn't just study grammar or memorize vocabulary anymore. I read, I listened, and I spoke. And as I did, my English improved. I learned how to communicate, how to express my feelings, and how to understand others. I learned that learning English wasn't just about knowing the right words. It was about understanding how to use them in real life. I nodded, feeling nervous. She started asking me simple questions about my favorite hobbies and what I like to do in my free time. At first, my answers were short, but then I remembered the stories I had read. I began telling her about my favorite story and how it made me feel. I explained how it was about a young man who wanted to be a doctor, just like me. I told her how much I admired the character's determination. As I spoke, I realized that I was using the new words I had learned from the stories. I wasn't thinking about grammar or vocabulary. I was just telling a story, just like I had practiced. By the end of the test, I was smiling. I had done it. I had spoken in English without feeling afraid. I had used the stories I had read to help me express myself, and when the teacher gave me my grade, I was shocked. I had passed with a high score. That was a turning point for me. I realized that learning English was not just about passing tests, it was about using the language to connect with others, to tell stories, and to share ideas. Stories had given me the confidence I needed to keep going. They had shown me that I could use English in real-life situations. And most importantly, They had shown me that I didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to keep trying. The weeks passed by, and with each day, I felt more connected to the English language. It was no longer something I had to study out of obligation. It had become a part of me, something I genuinely enjoyed. I no longer saw learning English as a challenge, but as an exciting adventure, just like the stories I read. Every new word I learned was like finding a new clue in a mystery. Every conversation I had was like stepping into a new chapter in a book. One day, as I was walking through the park, I saw an elderly woman sitting on a bench, reading a book in English. I noticed that she was smiling to herself, as if she was enjoying the story. I walked up to her and hesitated for a moment before I spoke. "Excuse me," I said nervously. "What book are you reading?" She looked up, smiled warmly, and replied, "It's a mystery novel. I have always loved reading, especially stories in English." I couldn't believe it. Here was a woman who had lived for many years, and she still found joy in learning and reading. I decided to sit down next to her, and we started talking. She told me about her life and how she had learned English when she was young, just like me. She said that stories had helped her too, and that they were her way of keeping her mind sharp. "Stories are powerful," she said. "They teach you not just words, but life. They teach you how to think, how to dream, and how to understand the world around you." Her words stuck with me. She was right. Stories weren't just tools for learning a language. They were windows into other worlds, other people's experiences, and different ways of thinking. I had spent so much time focused on learning English that I hadn't fully realized how much the stories were changing me as a person. They were shaping the way I saw the world, how I understood emotions, and how I communicated with others. Over the next few months, I began using English more and more in my everyday life. I wrote short stories of my own, practicing my writing skills. I started to keep a journal, where I wrote about my day, my thoughts, and my dreams. Each day, I wrote in English, and each day I improved. Sometimes I wrote about the characters from my favorite books. Other times, I made up my own stories. The more I wrote, the more confident I became in my ability to express myself in English. One afternoon, while I was at a cafe, I saw a young man sitting alone, looking frustrated. He had a notebook in front of him, and he was scribbling something in it. I noticed that he kept looking up at people around him, as if he was searching for the right words. I decided to approach him, remembering how many times I had struggled with the same feelings when I was first learning English. "Hey," I said softly, "are you okay?" He looked up, surprised. "Oh, yeah," he said, smiling awkwardly. "I'm just having trouble writing in English. I want to improve, but it's hard." I smiled, understanding exactly how he felt. "I used to feel the same way," I told him. "But then I started writing stories. It really helped me." His eyes brightened. "Stories?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "When you tell a story, it's easier to remember words and phrases, and you don't have to worry about being perfect. You just keep going. The more you write, the better you get." He nodded, clearly interested. I gave him some tips about how writing stories helped me, and we began talking about books and our favorite authors. I told him about my journey, how I had started with simple stories and gradually worked my way up. I told him about the stories that had inspired me and helped me learn. It felt good to share my experience with someone else who was going through the same thing I had. As the conversation ended, I felt proud. I had shared my knowledge with someone else, and I had helped him see that learning English wasn't about being perfect. It was about enjoying the process, about using stories to connect with the language and with others. In the months that followed, I continued to grow. I traveled to new places, and every time I did, I used English to communicate with people. Whether I was asking for directions or ordering food at a restaurant, I no longer felt nervous or unsure. English had become a part of my daily life, and even though I still made mistakes, I no longer worried about them. I knew that each mistake was just another step in my journey. One day, I received an invitation from my school to give a speech about how stories had helped me learn English. I was surprised but excited. I had never spoken in front of a large audience before. but I knew this was my chance to share my story with others. I spent the next few days preparing, writing down everything I wanted to say. I wanted to tell people how stories had transformed me, how they had opened my eyes to the beauty of language, and how they had made learning fun. The day of the speech arrived, and I stood in front of the audience, nervous but ready. As I began speaking, I realized that I was no longer afraid. The words came easily, and the story flowed naturally. I told them about the old man in the park who had given me the idea to learn English through stories. I spoke about the books I had read, the movies I had watched, and the conversations I had had. I told them about the power of stories to teach not only language, but also life. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the audience began to clap. I felt a rush of pride and happiness. I had done it. I had used the language to share my story with others, just like I had always dreamed. After the speech, many people came up to me and thanked me. Some told me they were inspired to start reading more, to write more, and to keep going with their English studies. Others shared their own stories of struggle and success. I realized that learning English wasn't just about my own journey anymore. It was about helping others on their path, too. As I walked home that evening, I thought about everything I had experienced. I had started as a beginner, unsure of myself and the language. But now I was confident. I had mastered English, not through memorization or fear of mistakes, but through the power of stories. I had learned to enjoy the process, to embrace the mistakes, and to keep going no matter what. And as I looked up at the stars, I remembered the old man's words. Don't quit. Stories will help you master the language. I smiled to myself. I knew that the journey was far from over. There were still many more stories to read, many more words to learn, and many more people to meet. But now, I knew one thing for sure. I would never quit. Because, in the end, the best way to master English and life is to keep telling your story.